Today we're going to be taking a look at 3 upcoming Steam games that have bad logos, discussing what's wrong with them, and then making new ones for them. If you want a more in-depth logo making guide, one will be coming out the same time this video does. Now, having a good logo obviously won't make your game do well on its own, but if the game is good, having a good Steam page is the best way to reel in new players, and a good logo is part of that. As far as I can tell, things like click-through rate and pricing don't really affect whether a game reaches the front page, and I say that as someone who's been on the front page. And because of that, you really want to get the ball rolling right away to give it its best chance, and since the Steam page is probably the first thing players will see of your game, making it look good should definitely be a priority. Now let's look at the first game. And just a little heads up, I'm going to ignore the majority of the Steam page because right now I'm really only interested in the logo. Unfortunately, I only have access to the low-res headers on Steam, but that's all we'll really need. And so here I feel like they missed on a few levels. Firstly, I don't think the yellow behind it works well. I think if they wanted to have a bold background color, that's fine, but something like a white border to separate it would go a long way. Also, the font being dull goes against the theme. A nice sharp font would fit it perfectly, and the chromatic aberration, which is the 3D glasses effect, could have been pushed further, because right now it almost looks like artifacting you'd see on an old monitor. Also, the game is about a ninja who fights to save their partner, but none of that really comes through here. And so here's what I ended up coming up with. Now keep in mind that mine is at a high resolution, so it's not a perfect comparison, but I also only spent like 20 minutes on it, and I think thematically it's just significantly better. The sharper text makes way more sense here, and then the title itself is literally within a blade, so the name takes on another meaning. And then the white outlines and drop shadow really help it stand out from the background. Now let's check out the second game. This one is obviously a lot simpler, but it kind of just looks like a default font and it's pretty terrible. In general, gradients are usually frowned upon for logos, but personally I like them. However, in this case I think it's definitely bad. It sort of just plays more into the default font look, and it doesn't really look like any thought was put into it. I think too, the lack of imagery is a big miss. It's not something required for it to be a good logo, but when the title is multiple descriptive words, it just seems like a waste to have only text. And so here's how my version came out. Like the last logo, I only really wanted to spend 20 or 30 minutes on this one, so while I think it's less successful than the last one, it's still definitely a big improvement on the original. The main reason I'm using the time constraint is because I don't want to spend a lot of time on someone else's project, but it also just shows that once you understand some fundamental concepts, it doesn't take much to jump from something bad to something serviceable like this. And so yeah, here I think even if you remove the imagery, it's still a lot better looking. The font just fits the theme a lot better, and the colors and 3D effect are a lot more visually interesting. Now for the third and final one, I'll show the entire creation process, so hopefully you can better learn how and why I did certain things. And again, this one only took 20 or 30 minutes, but if it takes you longer, don't worry about it. If I was actually making these for my own game, I'd spend more time perfecting them and probably trying out a few different styles. This one is pretty weird, and while that doesn't have to be a bad thing, I think it's sort of hard to read at a glance. It almost looks like it's trying to say N of S, which doesn't really mean anything to anyone, except for maybe people who've played the game, so whether or not they were going for that, it doesn't really matter because it's too confusing. The font I think is also pretty boring, so the first thing I'm going to do is go looking for new fonts. I dug through some Halloween ones because I think they should have the vibe I'm going for. Then I found this one called Crazy, and while it probably wouldn't work well as a main font, I think it can still be useful. This HVD crocodile font is what I'm going to be using for the main text because it's easy to read, and I think it's also set up really well for things like 3D effects. After that, I'm just repositioning the words so it's better balanced, and doing the same with the scratched versions. I also make all of the text white so it's easier to read. And because the font is so thick, I'm not going to be able to add outlines without everything touching each other. And for this I decided I want to avoid that, so instead I'm shrinking my selection and basically turning that base layer into the outlines. Then I mess around with some colors until I find something I think works well. For my 3D effect, I want my inner color to look like it's further back than the outline, so to achieve this I duplicate the outline layer, then select the contents of my inner layer and erase that selection from the duplicate. Then I just drag that to the top and give it a drop shadow. To make it even more 3D, I then take the original outline, duplicate it again, and move it down and darken it so the letters look like they're raised up. For inside the words, I want some sort of pattern that works with them. For spirits, I found a ghost pattern, and then for knights, I found a star pattern I think will work well. So I shape them so they only work for their own word, and then I set the layer mode to overlay so they take on the color underneath them. Now that the text is in a good place, I want to add some imagery. So here, since Knights is in the name, I add a moon because it's a simple shape and it's easily recognizable, so it won't take away from anything. Now for one of our final touches, I bring back in the scratch text and set it to the overlay layer mode. I think it really adds a spooky spirit aesthetic, and the text is still perfectly readable with it. Then I duplicated the entire project, merged the layers together, and added a drop shadow behind everything. And here's the final result after a bit of tweaking. I think it ended up being my favorite of the three, but let me know what you think. And if you want me to critique another logo or the logo for your game, just DM it to me on Twitter. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a full guide for making your own logo, so check that out if this wasn't in-depth enough for you. But that's all for now. Peace.